You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Wynand. He's a multi-time author. We talk about metaphysics and various philosophies, Christian theology, Greek philosophy, etc. He's got some really interesting thoughts on subjects I really don't cover very often. And I wanted to talk to him today about something he's discovered that I guess is changing the course of his thoughts, which he'll get into. But Wynand, thank you for coming. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Richard. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah. You were just starting to tell me about Albert Camus, but if you wouldn't mind, now that we're recording, can you repeat what you just said to me?
Yes, certainly. It was in the summer of 2017, just over 2 years ago, that I read his brilliant work in which he compares the metaphysics of Neoplatonism and early Christianity, specifically referring to Plotinus and St. Augustine. And it was such an inspiration to me, having been a long-time admirer of Camus, actually since the early 80s, that it inspired me to write down some thoughts on a range of metaphysical issues. And as I began writing, the ideas just kept flowing. And eventually it became a compendium, one could say, covering a wide range of issues, philosophical and theological and even socio-political in the final chapters, in which I use insights from classical Greek philosophy and also early Christian theology, both Greek and Latin, also adding elements from Indian philosophy in the process to state certain traditional positions on issues which many people may be interested in, but much of that mindset has been lost in the modern world through the rise of, first of all, rationalism, and later also secular humanism. And of course, in the current era, very much atheism and materialism. So I thought it would be a good idea to restate some of the traditional positions. And all along, I wasn't really sure if it was really something important or relevant that I was doing. I mean, there are much better thinkers than myself. I'm not at all an original thinker. I try to take things from others and put them together, which is, of course, a valid way of research.
Well, synthesis of other ideas is new, so there's nothing wrong with that.
Oh, thank you. But when the publisher and I received the endorsements from a number of scholars, which has gone onto the back cover of the new book, I was astonished. I couldn't believe it. I thought they must be referring to someone else. So that was an enormous boost to me and a motivation to continue writing.
What are the... again, this is an area I'm really not familiar with. So what are some of the thoughts that you've assembled, and then what are new conclusions you've drawn?
Would you mind if I mention some of the chapter headings in the book?
Sure. We'll start with that.
I've tried to make the headings as clear and concise as possible to give an idea of precisely what the chapters are about. And most of the chapter headings come in pairs. For example, the first one, after the historical background regarding the Indo-Europeans, is called Being and Non-Being. Then the next one is Metaphysical and Physical, then Mind and Motion, then Intellect and Necessity, and then Soul and Matter, and concluding with Levels of Being. So that basically the first part of the book covers traditional metaphysical views. And then it goes over into, one could almost say, more everyday areas, such as well-being and love is the one chapter. good and evil, truth and knowledge, time and eternity, death and immortality. And then there's a chapter on consciousness, something that we also touched upon in our previous conversation. And there I used that scheme by Raymond Bach on the 3 levels of consciousness, which is simple consciousness and self-consciousness and cosmic consciousness. And I then discuss 3 manifestations of this cosmic consciousness or higher consciousness, namely religion and mathematics and music, all of whom I regard as manifestations of such a consciousness. And then the 3 concluding chapters deal with socio-political issues, which by the very nature of things could be contentious or could stir a bit. And they are titled Man and Woman, Aristocracy and Democracy, and Freedom and Liberalism. So it covers, the book as a whole covers a fairly wide range of themes, I would think.
All right. So for someone that, those just, they sound like opposites, and there's not much depth to each of them yet. But what are some, we can't go through all of them, but pick a few that really stand out to you and tell me what's new in your synthesis of some of the ideas.
Well, let's start with one which is very much relevant in social discourse nowadays, namely man and woman. So taking the traditional view of gender coming from Greek philosophy and traditional Christian theology, for example, I argue that male and female are in fact polar opposites, and it should be accepted as such, that we differ fundamentally, and not only in terms of certain physiological functions, which is of course the modern view that man and woman are equal or not equal. They're identical in everything except in regard of certain physiological issues. But in the traditional understanding, the differences go much deeper, and it has to be that way because it has to do with the processes of life and the origins of life. And male and female have even been related to the traditional Indo-European view of universal essence and universal substance, which in Sanskrit is called Purusha and Prakriti, respectively. And so the two have to function as polar opposites in order to constitute the reality that we live in. And therefore, any attempt to deny these differences and to throw everyone into a total egalitarianism is just plainly wrong. So on the one hand, I criticize a phenomenon such as militant feminism, which is one of the features of our time, which appears, for example, in much of the entertainment world, in movies, in music, in some literature, even in theology, when one finds feminist theology. But on the other hand, I conclude that chapter by saying that both feminism, or especially in its militant form that we often encounter today, perhaps more in the Western world than in the rest of the world, that both this modern kind of feminism and the male chauvinism, which certainly was a dominant for much of our history, should be rejected as wrong. Both of them entail an unbalanced view of gender, because chauvinism views men as innately superior to women, and feminism views women as innately superior to men. And both of those should be...
I view them as both necessary parts of a whole, and without one, the other suffers, and vice versa.
That's right. So I then conclude that I agree with many of the authors that I refer to, that we differ fundamentally, although sharing the same human nature. In other words, we may have different functions still, but we are absolutely equal in value. There's no question of subordination or anything like that, or domination, which is how it's usually viewed whenever one speaks along these lines.
Well, how do you view, again, some people today are saying, there's 17 genders, and there's thisism and thatism, and I don't know, what's your view there? When people say I didn't even know the name of all these supposed genders, but what are your views when people talk about that? What are they doing, you think?
No, I think it's gone overboard, Richard. Of course, we can't condone certain things that happened in the past. When say people with different preferences were persecuted and legally punished and things like that. I certainly don't support that or call out for that. But I think the whole phenomenon has gone overboard. If you look, for example, at the acronym, for the same-sex and trans-sex movement, I think LGBT plus or plus plus or plus plus plus. Every year or so there's another item added to the acronym. So it's gone overboard. It's become unbalanced and distorted, which I view as inevitable because human nature tends to always, because of our innate rebellion against God, which has been going on for countless millenniums, we always tend to take things to extremes, especially when trying to correct something that could have been wrong in the past or probably was wrong. People tend to go to other extremes. According to the old principle that the further a pendulum, swings to the one side, the further it will swing back to the other side. So I'm afraid much of this current modern Western phenomenon regarding sexuality is unbalanced and over the top, and it's been taken to extremes unnecessarily.
Well, I think maybe people are confusing sexuality with gender. Sure, there could be, I guess, different kinds of sexuality, but there really only is two genders. Maybe
yes, of which
someone that feels neither somehow, but
well, by and large, absolutely yes. We have male and female, as we encounter throughout the animal kingdom, and of course on the physiological level, we are animals. There's no getting around that. We hope we aim or we strive to be more than animals on the spiritual level. But physically, we are very much animals. And I think by disregarding the laws of nature, in the end, or in the long term, it always brings disastrous results, whether to individuals or to society as a whole.
Yeah, I agree. So what's another concept that?
Another concept
really,
in the final chapter of the book, which is titled Freedom and Liberalism, I look at the concept of freedom, how it had traditionally been understood, with an emphasis being on freedom to, in other words, freedom to do something. Whereas in the viewpoint of liberalism, which is of course a modern political ideology, the emphasis is on freedom from. Now, of course, we all want to be free from oppression and tyranny and dictatorship and all these things. That stands to reason. But one doesn't really need a political ideology to tell you that. That's just common sense. It's basic rationality, which has been around for thousands of years. And then I show some of the manifestations of this ideology of liberalism in the modern era, and how also over the past 2 to 3 decades, it has become distorted even further into what some writers call post-liberalism. Some call it neoliberalism. And then there's, of course, also an ideology called neoconservatism, which was born in America and Britain in the 1980s, in the Reagan and Thatcher era, but which is just another version, actually, of liberalism. And in the same vein, I then continue by arguing that liberalism, especially with the apparent victory of liberalism over socialism, which occurred in the 1990s when the Soviet Union came to an end, and before that the Cold War ended. It was widely viewed as a vindication of Western-style capitalism. And that's why Fukuyama wrote that famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, by saying that the stage that the Western world had arrived at by the 1990s was basically the final point of human evolution. But there are many different ways of looking at that. And I also argue that the transitions that has taken place in the geopolitical world over the past century or so actually corresponds with certain cosmological models. For example, in the Cold War era, from the end of the Second World War until the end of the Soviet era, the world most of the world was situated in a bipolar world order, which was dominated by the American bloc on the one side and the Soviet bloc on the other side. And this corresponds to a dualistic cosmology, as is found, for example, in Gnosticism, where there are two principles with very little in common, if anything. And then with the ostensible victory of liberalism in the 1990s, which allied with capitalism, of course, it became a unipolar world order, which the elites in countries like America and Britain and France have been trying to enforce onto the whole world since that time. And this corresponds with a monistic cosmology, which says that everything, there's only one reality and very little room for differentiation. And then I write in support of a multipolar world order, that there should be various centers of civilization. And this was mentioned by Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, also dating from the 1990s, that instead of trying to enforce a single economic system and a single political system and a single value system onto the entire human population, it would be far better for everyone if we recognize that there are different value systems, and these are allied with different religious beliefs and different philosophical beliefs. And there's no reason in the world why they couldn't coexist peacefully, instead of trying to enforce a single system onto everyone, whether that system be one of the isms or another. And there's such a multipolar world order would then also correlate with a cosmological model of what I call a differentiated unity. In other words, with a supreme transcendent principle where everything begins, and which is called different names in different spiritual traditions, manifests in an almost infinite variety and diversity on this physical level in which we live. In other words, there is a unity, but it's a unity in diversity, and also from our viewpoint, a diversity in unity.
Well, there's been multiple religions for quite a long time, and they've functioned on their own, and they've been okay, and the world hasn't ended. So, yeah, there's no need, for instance, to have just one religion that everyone must adhere to, just like there probably doesn't need to be one economic system that everyone has to adhere to, or one philosophy, or one set of values, or one anything. But, I guess the sinister thing, and it's very sinister to me that I see nowadays, especially in the U.S., is that under the words of diversity and inclusivity and fighting fascism and all that, the people that they try to ram it down other people's throats and prosecute them and beat them into. It's just weird. They're using these words to do the exact opposite of what they're proclaiming they want to do.
Yes,
and they're doing it in a really violent and nasty way. So it's just kind of ironic and very sinister that they're using the exact same words that they're going against in everything they do to try to force this new order upon people.
That's right. Yes, they are the neoliberals or the post-liberals, as some writers call them. And they do these things in the name of freedom, of course, which makes it even more reprehensible, I would say. They are often more intolerant than the fascists or the communists were in the 20th century when it comes to silencing opposing viewpoints and things like that, which is certainly not a way to go forward, or a way to solve problems or disputes. For that, things like dialogue is always preferable to silencing opposing voices. So that is certainly one of the major threats in our time. And it certainly seems to be the case in much of the Western world, in Europe and North America. How much it is in the rest of the world, I'm not fully familiar with, but it is certainly a cause for concern, yes.
In North Korea, maybe the new, cool, relaxed place to live at some point. I know that won't happen. I'm just kidding.
Well, I'll be very glad if...
Hopefully it doesn't get that bad.
Yes, although I would be glad if the two Koreas can be unified before I end, or before I come to the end of this existence. But perhaps that will just remain a dream. I think many people would like to see where one nation has been divided along political lines or ideological lines, that could eventually be overcome. But that's of course not. It's not in our remit.
All right, maybe one more concept that really sticks out at you. We'll go for 3. 3 is always a good set of things to think about. We talked about gender, perception of it. We talked about the oneness of a political ideology. And what's the third concept that you want to bring up from the book?
I think something that might interest some listeners is in the chapter where I discuss death and immortality. Of course, it's unfashionable in the modern culture to mention the word death, let alone have a discussion about it. It's viewed as not part of civilized discourse, while in reality it's one of the most important things. I'm certainly not saying we should talk about it all the time or think about it all the time. We all still have to get on with living, but it should be pondered when there's an opportunity, and perhaps also as one grows older, is certainly important. Hence the old saying that only two things are certain: death and taxes. So in this particular chapter, I focus on death, on bodily death, the inevitability of it, the horror of it, but also the fact that it's not viewed as the end of all things, precisely because of the immortality of the soul. And then I go back to early Greek philosophy to discuss the teaching on the immortality of the soul by Plato, and before him by Pythagoras, and later by the Neoplatonists, and also their reasons why they believe the soul to be immortal. And I discuss the concept of transmigration, which some people call reincarnation, but it's not actually a precise rendering of how it used to be understood among the early Indo-Europeans. It was a more nuanced version than the one which is taught nowadays, for example, by the Theosophists and the Hare Krishna movement and so on. And then in the final section of the chapter, I touch upon what I call relative immortality through creativity. And then I take the examples of Homer and Nietzsche and also Mahler and Kafka as people who created works which have outlasted them. In the case of Homer, it's outlasted him by almost 3 millenniums. In the case of Nietzsche, who was, of course, an atheist, so we couldn't even consider the immortality of the soul. But he consciously strove to obtain a measure of eternal life through his works. For example, in one of his late works, he says, to create things on which time may try its teeth in vain. That was his aim. And in one of his ultimate, I think his penultimate work, Only the Day After Tomorrow Belongs to Me, some are born posthumously. And the same applies, of course, to the great Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who lived just before Nietzsche. And in both cases, they only achieved their fame posthumously from the early 20th century. And the same applies to Gustav Mahler, who is one of my favorite composers, who in his lifetime was better known as a conductor at the Vienna court opera. And he famously declared, Meine Zeit wird noch kommen, my time will yet come. And again, his contemporary Franz Kafka, the great novelist, who only became famous after his death when his friend Max Brod published his books. And then I just mentioned in the final sentence that an interesting coincidence is that both Mahler and Kafka were Bohemian-born, German-speaking Jewish intellectuals. Their time has certainly come to the benefit of civilized persons worldwide. So a tribute I'm paying to some of those great creators there. Sorry?
Oh, go ahead. Please continue.
No, sorry, Richard. Yes.
Oh, I just, I know it's a sad thing, but I just wonder, if you have a very lonely existence, because I don't know who would want to talk to you about a lot of these things. Sometimes I feel like, well, the things you're interested in just seem to be rare. I don't know if you have, if it's difficult for you to find other people that can and will and want to engage on some of these issues. Like, I know it's a strange thing to ask, but the people around you, the people you know, what are your thoughts there?
Yes, no, you are quite correct. Actually, I know very few people that I can discuss these things with. There are perhaps three or four friends in South Africa with whom I'm in contact from time to time. There's perhaps one or two here in Britain, one or two in America, and I think one in Greece. That's about it. So it's certainly less than 10 in total. So it's certainly most of the time it's my own thinking, my own thoughts, and I do talk to myself a lot. So perhaps that's a kind of a dialogue. Not as interesting as talking to someone else, but it's better than nothing.
Well, you can go back in time, I guess, and find comfort that others have thought, these thoughts through thousands of years, which is great, But in the modern sense, it's much harder to find that stuff. I know, like, for instance, Ryan Holiday has taken up the banner of Stoicism, and he talks about it quite frequently. The thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, but it's rare. It seems very rare, and especially what you've been thinking about and researching. What I don't know how you'd put it into words, but it seems like you have a good command of various philosophers and major lines of thought through thousands of years. How has this changed your perception of the world and your relationships and your everyday existence. Like anything you can put into words that has changed in your worldview in the past few years?
It has certainly shifted some priorities in my life. Undoubtedly, things that many other people take very seriously, like say, politics and elections and debates and all these things. I see them as passing and ephemeral, and at the end of the day, do they really change that much, in as far as our lives are concerned? Whether it's this party ruling or that party ruling, or this politician or that politician. Of course, some ideologies have had huge influences over societies. One only has to think of the 20th century, with some of the radical ideologies, whether they were far left or far right or even in the middle, and the things that they have done. So I think reading philosophy and theology, metaphysics very much has helped me to not take those things too seriously or as much as I used to in my young days. My first degree was in political studies, so I thought that politics was something very grand, very special. Now, of course, it affects all of us, the decisions made by the powers that be. But I don't think it's really worth breaking our heads over, and especially not getting angry, towards other people, having conflicts and endless debates and emotions being whipped up and so on. It's simply not worth it. There are far more interesting things in life. And I absolutely believe that I have to continue doing this. So I'm hard at work now on the next book, which is provisionally titled Origins, and in which I, again, restate certain positions coming from traditional philosophies and religions. And in the process, I want to take issue with some of the dominant views on certain kinds of origins, as found, for example, in the academic world, whether it's cosmic origins or human origins or cultural origins. I believe that there's a lot of vested interests in the academic world. It is certainly not the disinterested, objective, neutral sphere, which I think is how most people view the academic world. They also have their vested interests that they serve. And of course, there's the famous argument by Thomas Kuhn around half a century ago about knowledge being expressed in the form of paradigms. And the same applies to scientific knowledge and any other kind of academic knowledge. It doesn't accrue gradually, which I think is how most people think, and also because it fits in with the Darwinian model of gradual incremental changes in evolution, which many people contest. Instead, knowledge, including scientific knowledge, moves by means of paradigms. And each time a paradigm become established, it's very difficult to change that. So at the moment, neo-Darwinism is the ruling paradigm in the biological sciences. To some extent, one could say a combination of relativity and quantum theory in the physical sciences. But before that, for a long time, it was the Copernican model and the Newtonian model, and it was difficult. It was really problematic to change those. And the current ones, of course, are also deficient in certain aspects. I don't know if you're familiar with a metaphysical and physical scientist with the name of Wolfgang Smith in California.
Wolfgang Smith? No.
Yes. It's certainly someone I would recommend if you can, if you wish to approach him for an interview. Some of his supporters have recently founded a project called Philosopher, from harking back to the Greek words. It's actually philia, which means loving friendship, and Sophia, which means wisdom. Hence the origin of the word philosophy, which therefore means love of wisdom in the strict technical meaning, which is also how the classical Greeks understood it. Philosophy was not for them armchair philosophizing or speculating about things naively. It was a deadly serious affair. And it was also related to, at the end of the day, to our salvation. It was intimately connected with classical philosophy, not only among the Greeks, but also among the ancient Indians and Chinese, of course, what people call Hinduism and Taoism. So Wolfgang has been doing extremely important work on the interaction between physical science on the one hand, because that's what he was trained in. He was a mathematician for decades, a professor of mathematics at prestigious institutes like MIT and UCLA. But since his retirement from that in the 80s, he's been focusing on the metaphysical side and its interaction with physics. Quantum physics being one of his specialities. So he's over the past couple of years, he's written a number of extraordinary books again, in which it becomes clear that entirely new paradigms are needed for the physical sciences as well. Not only in biology and elsewhere, but also in the physical sciences, where I think many people thought that with quantum theory and the ongoing speculation about string theory and grand unified theory and so on, we've basically come to as far as we can go with knowledge of the physical world. But it seems
I've interviewed, well over 2,000 people, but I've interviewed, I would say probably, at least 700 scientists, clinicians, and when I bring up anything metaphysical, they go, we won't go there. No one wants to talk about it, and they'll either laugh at it, or they'll not want to comment on it. And I know part of it's because it may jeopardize their funding. They may look bad to peers and be attacked, and it's very sad. But that's what I see in the aggregate when I speak to a lot of people. There's the people that will not say much about it, but they do have their beliefs, and then the people that don't believe in anything, and they'll just laugh at people that do believe in things and ridicule them.
Yes, I feel sorry for them actually, Richard, because the people who ridicule the reality of metaphysics and reject it altogether, which of course is the fashionable thing in the modern world, and especially in the academic world, because they're missing out on a great deal of intellectual satisfaction. And if I use the word intellectual in brackets almost, or in a conditional sense, because most people also confuse the intellectual with the rational. And in the traditional understanding, these are two different things. The rational is what we use all the time for everyday thinking. So 2 + 2 = 4. And, if this happens, that will happen. And it's very important. We can't live without it. We can't survive without rational thinking. But all of the metaphysical and spiritual traditions agree that above the rational level, there's an intellectual level. In Greek, the word for that is nous, N-O-U-S, which is translated as mind or intellect. And it is taught by all of the great spiritual teachers that we can attune our individual reason to that huge universal mind or intellect. And for example, when I listen to certain kinds of music, mostly classical music, from the Renaissance until some of the 20th century composers even, it's as if I can access that world, that higher world. It becomes clear. And I don't think I'm being conceited or anything. Many other people have also experienced music in that way. So it's absolutely, like I said, I can only feel sorry for those who deny the reality of that higher metaphysical world, or worlds even.
Yeah, true. So, Wynand, we're running out of time for this session. It's like you're at the doorway to an entire new world of thought and study that people would have to engage in. What's the first few steps for people that are listening, that are interested? What are the titles of one or more of your books that they want to look at, and how would they find out more and get in touch?
Well, the only books I've published so far are the first one which appeared last year, From Logos to Bios, on which you already kindly had an interview with me early in the year, which deals with Greek philosophy and evolutionary theory, in which I suggest alternative theories of evolution, such as directed evolution and evolution according to natural law, to replace the current model of neo-Darwinism. And then this second book, which appeared a few months ago, titled Reality, From Metaphysics to Metapolitics, quite a number of my articles have been published also, and in various journals and elsewhere, and most of them I have placed on my academia site. So would that be a place I could recommend if someone wanted to read more of it?
Yeah, that's fine. What's the URL of the site, or what's an easy way for people to Google and find you?
Let me see.
You have an unusual name, which is good. Wynand de Beer. In Google, you come up pretty quick, which is good.
That's right.
You sure you don't have any cousins in the De Beers family, right? And in South Africa?
No, I'm afraid I'm from the poor side of the family.
Shame.
Many people have asked me that. Yes, the URL for that is independent researcher.
Independent researcher, okay.
.academia .edu / and then after the slash, it's my Orthodox name, which is Vladimir de Beer. So all of that is one word, Vladimir de Beer.
Okay, and I'll make sure in the show notes that we have that, so it'll be written and verbal. So, okay. Well, very good. Well, Wynand, I'm always glad to talk to you. I appreciate it. You're a voice from a place that, like I said, few people will talk about at all. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's kind of you, and all the best for the future.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.